Welcome everyone to the October 2016 Soils Network of Knowledge webinar, an analysis of Australian farmers' soil testing practices over the last 20 years with Lisa Lobby-de Bruin. I'd like to introduce Dr. Lisa Lobby-de Bruin, who's a senior lecturer in the School of Environmental Sciences and Natural Resources Management at the University of New England. Lisa's research activities focus on building a better and clearer understanding of the issues involved in the development of sustainable agricultural systems, as well as farmers' understanding of soil health and how land condition, and in particular the role of soil biota, can be monitored. She represented the Ecological Society of Australia on the Liverpool Plains Regional Vegetation Committee and was involved in the development of the Regional Vegetation Management Plan for the area. Today, Lisa's going to talk about her recent work looking at Australian farmers' soil testing practice over the last 20 years.
Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you for attending. So this is, as Abby pointed out, analysis of Australian farmers' soil testing practice over the last 20 years. The work is actually published, and I'm just going to present the Australian component today. But my US colleague, Dr. Susan Andrews, who's based in the USDA NRCS National Soil Survey Centre, worked on the American component with me. So what I'm focusing on today is the core of our understanding, and where possible, some of the smaller surveys conducted by research and development corporations, what they can tell us about farmers' soil testing practice. I'm also going to be embarking on later this year, a survey of some soil workshops in the Northern Tablelands local land services, and I'm hoping that that'll shed some light on our understanding of soil testing practice by farmers, because as this paper will show you, presentation, national level statistics have proven to be somewhat limiting. So by introduction, I suppose there's a reason for soil information, and here we're focusing on soil testing for farmer application. There's a number of potential reasons. Firstly, to satisfy interest in and curiosity around soil health, to focus on soil health as a metric or way of understanding how biologically active our soil is and how that may contribute to overall ecosystem function in your soil. Also to improve on awareness of soil change and where we may be losing soil condition, and this could be soil acidity or loss of carbon or imbalance in nutrients. And by identifying correctly the type of land condition issues, we hopefully can provide a much greater likelihood of determining the best course of remedial or preventative action. And I think those last 3 points I've mentioned are really repeatedly stated in soil policy and government documents, and I think we've often assumed this is why farmers should be soil testing. What do we know? And the approach I took was to use Australian Bureau of Statistics surveys, and of course they're focusing on these wheat sheep zones in the purple, and in the olive green, the high rainfall zone grazing areas. So ABS along with ABARES have conducted a number of surveys over the years, and the most recent ones I'll be focusing on mainly, which are called Land and Management Practices Surveys or Resource Management Survey. The pre-2007-2008, this is an example of the earlier surveys by Australian Bureau of Statistics, and in this question you can see that they've basically asked a range of questions, and they wanted the landholder to indicate yes or no whether in this particular zone, the wheat, sheep and high rainfall zones, whether they were soil or plant tissue tests to determine fertilizer or soil conditioner requirements. So basically they've built in the motivation for the soil testing. All they've asked really is whether the landholder is undertaking it or not. And they have not bound this, so there's no time frame. So literally people could say, even if they tested 10 years ago, that it is part of their farm practice or management. So we can glean very little from this sort of questioning. We don't understand the motivation behind soil testing, and neither the intensity or frequency. Post 2007, 2008, the Australian Bureau of Statistics were largely asking about soil condition, and this was partly driven by the CMAs who were having targets, if you like, on soil condition, and they wanted to know what was the contribution of soil testing in terms of farmers understanding what the soil condition was like. So they asked this question again. This is different in a way because they've time bounded. So they've actually stated over a financial year, the previous financial year, whether soil testing took place, yes or no. And then they delved into what did the soil test include. So people could indicate whether they're looking at soil pH, nutrient levels, but again, no specificity here. So nothing about, nitrogen, phosphorus, magnesium or potassium, organic matter levels, but not necessarily organic carbon, salinity levels and other. So that's the level again. Again, it doesn't actually have any idea of sampling intensity or farmer motivation to undertake the soil testing itself. Now recently, in 2013-14, ABS no longer asks if farmers soil test. So literally they've moved to a different area about soil management, and we might say, well, is it enough to know that a farmer's applying soil amendments and assume that they are doing this based on soil testing, but we don't have any information on soil testing in the current ABS surveys. So what did I glean from those previous surveys? And these are the time-bound ones. So essentially they're asking about soil testing in that year. And Jodie Mewett from ABARES actually gave me this data because I would not have actually been able to build these graphs from the data cubes that you can get online because I didn't actually know the population. So without the population, I could not have calculated the percentages here. So we have two graphs, one showing the grazing industry outside rangelands, so the high rainfall zone, and the other one's showing the broadacre cropping businesses. And the two ones that they analysed was testing soil pH and testing nutrient levels. And what we can say, of course, is that in the grazing industry, there's a lower percentage of soil testing, declining from 20 to 15%. And in the cropping broadacre industry, it's under 30% and steady, if you like, but also dropping to just over 25%. So the data collected by ABS through this period on soil testing provides little more than an indication that the practice has been undertaken in that previous year, but very little about motivation, application, or intensity of the practice. The other difficulty we have here is that we do not have any idea if this people saying they were soil testing are the same people saying they're soil testing in this period. So we have no idea of continued commitments to soil testing or whether this 25% is different to this 25%. And so we don't know how ongoing the commitment is to soil testing. So there's some idea about can we hypothesize why farmers appear to be only doing limited soil testing? Again, no idea of volume or frequency. And one of the soil scientists I interviewed suggested that maybe people were avoiding soil testing because then they wouldn't have to address any declining soil condition. So, again, it's an assumption, we don't really know. The analogy I'd like to make, though, is that I recently read a study by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare that showed 30% of people are putting off or avoiding going to the dentist altogether because of the cost. So maybe that's another issue. If you don't test your soil, you don't realise what you're missing or require, you're maybe avoiding some of the cost of treating those imbalances in nutrients or addressing declining pH or whatever it may be. So what other interest is there in other soil attributes? And if we look at this, this was conducted by the review for the National Soil Research Development and Extension Strategy that came out at the end of 2014. And one thing it did confirm was the lack of physical and biological soil testing. So soil testing largely seems to be focused on chemical properties, and that includes soil pH, nutrients, electrical conductivity, soil organic carbon. So that was the bulk of soil testing, whereas physical and biological non-soil organic matter soil testing was rather limited. We also don't have any information on the prevalence of observational indicators, whether they're being used or not, so there's no questioning on that. And some of the smaller surveys I looked at as part of this research showed that in the Lachlan and Macquarie valleys of New South Wales, that landholders actually rate factors according to the importance of their land management decision making, such as organic matter and soil structure, were rated quite highly. So about 90% of them said so, but we can't actually confirm this with this national level statistics, which seems to suggest the opposite, that they're not being used very frequently. Another source of data I got, which was taken from some soil testing facilities, and there are a number of publications just looking at the volume of soil that's runs through laboratories. So that gives us a different way of looking at this information. And this is from the late 80s through to 2012. And what I've done is made a few assumptions of my own. One is that with 100% participation, and we're looking at the number of samples that you might find over 100 hectares in cropped areas only, and that seems to suggest they would be very low densities. But of course, as we've shown, probably the participation isn't that high. So if I assume 30% participation, we can see that the numbers per 100 hectares improve slightly, but it still hasn't reached double digits. So this just does give you some sense that the level of intensity of soil sampling is very small. So and even though we have seen this increase in amount of or volume of soil tests, we have to also appreciate that this period in 2001 was only 15 million hectares cropped, compared to 2012, where we had 30 million hectares under crop. So there's different seasonality impacts. So what I tried to do then was to try and link soil testing to decision making, and the only one I could find that I could get from Australian Bureau of Statistics was applying fertilizer. So there's very little information about what people do with soil testing other than this decision-making process. And so I had these 4 different surveys from ABS, and what we looked at was the percentage of businesses who use fertilizer, and again, this is not 100%. So you're looking at around 60% of businesses are using fertilizer, and of those they were asked, what decision methods do you use for applying the fertilizer you apply. And so you can see that they could tick a range of different methods, and soil testing featured here. So it's about 40% of those that are applying fertilizer basing it on soil tests, but they're also using quite a few different other methods. So consultants' recommendations feature quite strongly, as well as just putting standard annual rate. So there are a number of different ways people can do this, but soil testing is not by no means clearly dominant. And so what are some of the R&Ds? So the Grains Research and Development Corporation did a baseline survey of farming practices, and you can see by the numbers here, the soil testing questions were 155. There's actually a survey of about 191 questions, so they were quite intense. And what I wanted to point out with this survey was just the sort of assumptions that are built into some of these questions. So the first question was, do you routinely undertake nutrient soil tests? So one, what is the meaning of routine? What does that mean? And also they've built in about nutrient for purposes and not for anything else. Again, it's just yes or no. What are the percentage of your arable land has soil testing? And again, that's not a time period, so we don't know if that just means this year or the previous 2 years. Then they're asking how often do you soil test any given paddock, and you can see that there is some idea of how frequently soil testing may occur. The last question is about your arable land and what percentage of it has its fertilizer use based on soil tests, and then they've confounded the question a little bit by putting or other predictive tools. So they're trying to link in some motivation for soil testing and why you might use it, but they've also built in a confounding point. So is soil testing used for monitoring soil health? And I think that was my focus of when I was looking at this information. But it is very difficult to determine this because people are not asked, actually. And so even in the GRDC Farm Practices Baseline Report, try to get behind the purpose of soil testing. And they said it was largely to determine fertilizer requirements. But if you look at that question, which I just showed you, they weren't offered any other choices. And so the question was closed and confounded by the including other predictive tools. So it wasn't clearly just about soil testing. So this is the sort of figure they came up with when they asked that question, and interestingly they then dropped the other predictive tools, but they had the percentage of farms where soil testing is used to match fertilizer requirements, and you can see that it seems quite high in some areas, but of course this is a survey of about 5% of the population, or some 1,300 people. So we don't necessarily know if how widespread that is exactly. So moving along, I suppose my keen interest in this whole use of soil information is what is its role? Is it important in motivating in farm scale decisions and driving better practice? And I think one of the requirements is we need to have a better investment in soil knowledge exchange. And here's a little picture of me when I was in America, in North Dakota, and I was learning from this farmer here, David Porsborg, who's actually been soil testing along with his father for the last 40 years. And he's probably not your typical farmer, but it does show you that there are landholders out there that are very much interested in their soil and gathering that information. So he could have insights into how his farming practice. And his main interest was actually looking at the activity of the soil biota and their mineralising of nitrogen, and this affected how much fertilizer he would purchase. So there are some examples out there, but there are also difficulties in gathering that local evidence that soil information actually drives better practice. So the example I'm using here is Notill, and Llewellyn and Demden have done a lot of work on this, and you can see here the adoption of no-till has had a very long trajectory. So there's a very long tail here where there wasn't a lot happening for nearly 20 years, and then there's been an escalation or an increase in adoption of no-till. And in their analysis, they asked landholders why they adopted no-till, and these were the three main reasons. So you can see reduced fuel and labour costs at seeding, soil conservation, and soil moisture management. So if you like, importance of soil is there as one of the main reasons, but I would suggest that you could easily monitor your fuel and labour costs, and you could more easily monitor soil moisture management. But knowing that you have more soil or have conserved more soil through this adoption is probably a lot harder to actually have evidence for. So the other interesting thing is those that are adopting it, a lot of them have paid advice from agronomists and also a member of local farmer groups. So the importance of farmer-to-farmer connection is obviously is important, and often the agronomist may be the key person that, if you like, is interpreting a lot of that soil information for farmers. So I recently spoke to Mike Bell, and he informed me that there has been a recent scoping report for fertilizer decisions on nitrogen, and he said that the agronomists were largely the person conducting the soil tests and advising the farmers based on the results they got. But we can also see that those social networks with farmers is really important in terms of reinforcing that information. So farmers, this is taken from the Border Rivers Guida region, which is largely the Northern Tablelands now, part of the Northern Tablelands Local Land Services. But over the years, from 2007 through to 2012, that farmer connection has remained quite steady and in a high proportion. Whereas some of the regional organisations and Landcare have sort of waxed and waned over the years, but we can see that they're not as important as those farmer networks. So if we want to make connections with landholders, then we really need to bring them all together. So that probably means we need to maintain our field days and our face-to-face events where we can get people in the same space. The other one, of course, is trying to build on some of these online features, and so things like this webinar is a good example. But we know that most landholders still very much enjoy those traditional extension activities, but we'd have less and less people on the ground. So we find that we have to rely on some of these online mediums to allow people to tap into expertise. And this is an example where we have the e-extension, and it's also in America as well. And this allows landholders, or anyone actually, to look at issues on crop nutrition and plant protection in Australia, and it can provide that timely and useful information when people need it. So another one, of course, is the Soil Knowledge Network in New South Wales, where there's a lot of retired soil scientists who can move around the areas. So my conclusion, I suppose what I wanted to emphasise was to assess the value of soil information. That may be soil testing, or it may be about soil maps or other soil information and knowledge used by farmers. It's important to be inclusive of all soil knowledge. So that might be gained through education and or experience. And I think importantly I've learned through this is that we should not assume we know what interests farmers about either soil or soil testing. And so the national level surveys I've just spoken about do reflect that we have very limited understanding of what farmers are doing with their soil testing information. So if we want to improve what we know and improve the connection, I think, with landholders, we need to much more broaden and deepen our understanding of farmers' soil testing practice. So we need to ask those questions whenever we can. And lastly, I think, if we want to understand our impact in our extension and our research activities, actually have to look at better monitoring and evaluation of our engagement. And I know most of you are out there and you're doing a lot of good work with landholders, but I think we don't necessarily monitor and evaluate how well our engagement is and what sort of impacts we're having on decisions. So one of the out in my in surveys of farmers in doing soil health workshops is, questions like what would make you consider soil testing again, and maybe what would convince you to soil sample more often. And hopefully I'll get a chance to present this information because I'm organising a soil regional forum under the Soil Science Australia New South Wales Northern Tablelands branch, and I just wanted to save the date sort of thing. It'll be here at UNE, University of New England, on the Smart Farm on the 16th and 17th of February. So hoping a few people can make that if they can. So this is where a lot of the information I've presented. If you wanted to look at it more closely, this is the reference, and I think Abby's made that available so you can see that in your little window there. And thank you very much for listening, and I'm open for any questions that you may have, as long as they're not too tricky. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was great. And, I think probably a bit sobering that we don't know a great deal, and yet we make decisions about things and give funding money to all sorts of things with limited information. So food for thought. As I said earlier, there's time for questions or comments on Lisa's presentation. We have a question already from Richard Koch. I hope that's pronounced properly, Richard, and he just wanted to know how you would define soil health, Lisa.
Okay. Yes. Well, I suppose the soil health I was thinking about, often that John Duran, who first spoke about soil health, is the whole gamut, really. So it's not just about the soil chemical or it's the physical features, the biological features as well, and how they help the soil function. So he often talked about it functioning for a particular purpose, but I think we have to value the sort of functions like nutrient cycling, water movement. So those sort of ecosystem functions, I think, are very important.
And I think in our last webinar, I think it was last month, Seymour actually had a definition, one of his definitions too, which
Yeah.
essentially said that to sustain plant and animal production, maintain or enhance water and air quality, and promote plant and animal health. So that was the direct
Yeah.
quote that she had up there.
Yeah.
So I guess that's generally agreed that that's what.
So I think I suppose soil testing as it stands is quite limited in that it's really only looking at largely the chemical side of things and really not the soil structure or and very rarely the soil biological activity.
I'll just unmute Luke and see if he has any questions. Luke, you're unmuted now.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, Lisa, great talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
People seem to hold strong opinions on whether farmers soil test or not. Why do we have such strong opinions when we don't really have much data to back it up?
Yeah, well, that was interesting because when I did this paper, I talked to a lot of soil scientists, and they would quite adamantly say, without much evidence, that well, I don't think farmers soil test very much. And then other people, yeah. So it is interesting. I have no real understanding of why that is so. I think people just and also have other assumptions too, like people don't what is it they might not soil test because they see it as someone's trying to sell them a product, and they that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't really know why it's so people have such adamant views when there's not really that much information on it. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else got any ideas?
Yeah.
If
If
like
anyone
to
else
hear.
wants to chime in there, that's a good opportunity. In the meantime, there's another question here from Andrew Daly, and he has said, in addition to what is tested for traditionally, is there increasing importance either at the farmer or researcher level in monitoring biological activity, and what might be considered key indicator species or groups for overall soil health? Is there further room for test development?
Yeah, so it's basically about soil biota, is it? Or
It seems like that because he's
soil?
given an example, could we use nematodes as a indicator species, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think I read there was a visiting scientist last year that came to Armidale, and he was Carl Ritz, and it's interesting that he said that obviously when some people promote certain soil biota, they have their favourites. They might say, "Oh, this is great," or "This is great," and he was adamant that there was you need to have a combination of measures. You can't just focus on one aspect. So probably a bit of soil biota activity, but also say physical properties or chemical properties. I think some of the difficulties as scientists we often have in saying what is what should people be testing for, is that we're often realise that a lot of microbial activity or soil biota is very much affected by it's like a chicken and the egg argument. It's very much affected by the soil properties as well. So, you just can't single out any single things because they might be, it's very highly variable. And I suppose that's why people are reticent sometimes to say you should be measuring this or you should be measuring that, because we don't necessarily have a good baseline of soil biological variability in particular soils. So we can't necessarily give you a definite answer. So if you find that, that means your soil's great, and if you find that, whereas something like soil pH is more definitive. We can say if the soil pH is X, that's clearly a neutral pH, and so that's reasonable for this or that. But it's not so easy to do with soil biota, I think.
I think I was going to step in there and say that the soils unit here at DPI and others, I guess, look more about what is the function that that those organisms are carrying out, and to look at it from that perspective. So then it doesn't matter so much what the organism or group of organisms is that function occurring. And Steve Kimber, he's a researcher here at Wollongbar, would want to say something about that.
Yep, no worries. Yeah, I think the whole problem with this is like Bertrand Russell, stated the whole problem is that the world's full of fools who are so certain of themselves and wise people who are so doubtful. And I think that's what some of the problem as to why soil testing is not taken up so much, in that anyone who wants to sell a product will tell you what the results are going to be, whereas as researchers you would have plenty of experience that it can take us a few years to prove what's going on.
Yeah.
I've got a few comments. I think that the definition of soil testing needs to be looked at, and whether you're going to miss data from farmers doing test strips in their crops, for instance, with different products, and soil health the soil health test kits like developed by Richmond Landcare, which only had some input to. I haven't read your paper, so I don't know if you've looked at that sort of.
No. Yeah, and I think, and I've also done a qualitative survey of farmers, and what was interesting when they were asked about soil, when they were looking at their soil, they often said they were continually monitoring their soil. So what we think of as soil testing, they might be doing, they felt they were actually always monitoring their soil, but it might not have been in that formal, documented way. So I think we need to be able to, capture that other observational. People might be sceptical about, the boot test and the various other things that exist where people go around and look at their soil, but it's not a formal soil testing as such, but then again it's still observational and may have some importance to them. So I think we probably need to, like you said, look at what we think of as soil testing, or even what we think of as soil information. So maybe it's a more general understanding of soil types and their behaviour, and it might not necessarily require lots of soil testing as such. Yep.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So we don't really know that part of it either. So yeah.
Thanks, Steve.
I suppose I would be interested to know, if when people get their soil test, what they actually get, So I'm thinking, the agronomists out there, or the advisors out there, when you're interacting with your clients, are you presenting the whole image of what their soil's like, or just particular aspects of it? So that was another question I thought I would like to know is what sort of interactions do advisors have with their clients on soil, and what sort of information do they discuss with them? I don't know.
Okay. Right. So if
anyone's got any
comments or observations
that
on that would be great. In the meantime, Richard has another question, which he was interested to know: were there any striking differences between the US and Australia in soil testing, and if so, what were they?
Yeah, well, it was interesting that everyone assumed, because the US has a lot, they've a lot more. Their soil testing is quite a lot cheaper than Australian soil testing, that it would have been higher. And I focused on the corn belt of the US, and it turned out that their soil testing was no higher than Australia. But one of the difficulties was actually trying to pin it down to farms, because what their statistics present was the percentage of acres or that are soil tested. So again, it was very hard to actually figure out how much was done farmer to farmer, and it turned out that they were only soil testing, probably less than 30%. That was for N, P, and K, and that was surprising as well, that they weren't soil testing as much as I would have thought.
That is
interesting.
And
and that was also interesting that they were still putting on 100% of their fertilizer. So 100% of their farming country was fertilized, but only 30% was tested, and that was despite the rhetoric in the documents that were saying that soil testing is really important for moderating fertilizer use, because a lot of the Corn Belt area is they're very concerned about nitrogen losses and pollution, and despite that they had very few looking at how much nitrogen was in their soil. I did talk to Mike Bell a couple of weeks ago, and I think one of the interesting comments he made about soil testing was that people did get more soil testing done 10 years ago when they were, resellers were trying to, they'd throw the soil testing in with the fertilizer, before you bought the fertilizer. So he reckons that because that's not happening as much anymore, that people aren't necessarily, soil testing's not happening through the reseller, people just buying whatever the cheapest fertilizer they can find, so they're not necessarily having the reseller drop in, put in the soil test as part of the package. But he also, he sort of felt that if you wanted to identify constraints, then you could do soil testing, but you wouldn't necessarily have to do it that often. You might do a one-off and then identify some of your constraints, and then every now and then go back, and maybe it wouldn't have to be that often. But yeah, he because he's into looking at phosphorus and other specific nutrients, he actually felt soil testing wasn't always robust enough, and that a lot of other factors come into play. So I suppose again he was looking at from just a nutrient requirement, not necessarily, there's a lot of other things happening in the soil, like the physical soil structure, which we obviously does greatly affect the availability of nutrients. So if you've got a poor soil structure, or you're not going to get any of those nutrients if it's not holding on to water and that sort of thing. So yeah, and probably soil testing is just only looking at one aspect. Yeah.
And just to let people know who aren't aware, Mike is a researcher based in southern Queensland and has done a lot of research in the sugar and cropping industry.
But I found through the paper that there's a lot, soil health, even though we can't, or actually measuring it or not, but soil health as a motivator was incredibly of value. So people would say they were interested in soil health, growers and farmers and so on, but they might not actually be able to say in any definitive way whether their soil health was improving or not through their practice. But it was a powerful motivator for changing practice. So a lot of my paper also looked at trying to link soil information to soil health management. But what I could see is that the value of soil health was a motivator for change, but basing it on actual whether they knew their soil health was improving or not improving wasn't the reason for the change. Well, it was, they wanted to improve, but they couldn't tell you whether it was improving or not. Do you know what I mean?
There's a really long series of comments here from Jeff Minchin, and rather than me read that out, Jeff, I might unmute you and see if you can talk to those if you'd like.
Yeah, so I did write a few comments there. My experience is that we tend to be using soil testing a bit more targeted in the mixed farming zone. Paddocks aren't to expect that every paddock would be tested every year is probably unrealistic. It's more on a scheduled basis, so once every 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
And we tend to be using a lot more nutrient budgeting in between times to, replace whether it be phosphorus or nitrogen mostly. Where it's used is where you've got subsoil constraints or you're seeing nutrient deficiencies in crop or in pasture, then they'll do a more targeted type sampling to try and address those issues.
Yeah.
It's soil health, I think, where I'm down in the Riverina, so soil health is on the minds of a lot of growers down this way. But in terms of, say, nitrogen testing, deep end tests, they're done probably a bit more regularly than, say, a more comprehensive test.
Okay.
And Jeff,
I'm trying to think where else I wrote there.
Is the budgeting just about replacing what's removed in the crop, or is it more involved than that?
No, it's mostly around crop removal. But, during the Millennium Drought, we've seen our coal P levels down the south go from sort of 20s and 30s and sometimes lower up into the 50s, 60s, 70s, and there are some paddocks that are much higher than that, up into the hundreds. So we tend to be mining some of the phosphorus back a little bit because those levels are pretty high, and putting money towards more nitrogen because that tends to be where the bang for buck is in our cropping systems, and being able to just maintain those phosphorus levels, up around 40 or 50 cobble P.
So it's more of so if you did soil testing for that, it would be more of a way of saying, well, I don't need to necessarily fertilise or not. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So we rather than do, say, the comprehensive test because we know our P levels are high, we should have a liming history that tells us that our lime or pH of soil is about right. Then we would concentrate on, say, a deep end test to work out what nitrogen levels we should be putting out and using a nutrient budget.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. That's really good information. Comments.
Thank you.
The only other thing I had there was you had a question about what reports advisors are giving out, and from the reseller network and some private agros down this way, they tend to be using the Nutrient Advantage program from IPL, but then they'll add some local knowledge or experience to the advice they might put on those reports.
Okay. Yeah. So the report would be tailored to make recommendations on specific nutrients. Is that what you're saying? Right.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Mostly they focus on the N, P, K, and S.
Okay. Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
And take this opportunity to thank Lisa for presenting for SNOC this month. It was really interesting.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone who's still out there. Thank you for listening, and it was good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that we will call it a day. Thank you again, Lisa, and thank you everyone for attending. See you next month, hopefully.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.